Good evening, visitors. Welcome to the Australian War Memorial's last post ceremony. My name is Suzanne Peterson, and joining us tonight from the Australian Army is Warrant Officer Class 2 Michelle de Friskbaum. Today we remember the Australian and British prisoners of war who died at the Sandakan prisoner of war camp, or as a result of the Sandakan death marches during the Second World War. The Sandakan death marches remain the greatest war atrocity committed against Australians. In 1942, the Japanese sent prisoners of war from Singapore to build an airstrip at Sandakan, Borneo. Over time, their rations were reduced and physical abuse increased. In 1945, with Allied forces advancing towards Borneo, the Japanese began marching Australian and British prisoners of war westward to Renau, through the island's rugged interior. The weak and malnourished prisoners staggered along jungle tracks for more than 260 kilometres. Many died en route, their bodies never recovered. Those too weak to continue were killed by the guards. Of the 2,500 prisoners of war originally held at Sandakan, only 6, all Australians, survived the war. We welcome the veterans who have served, those that are still serving, and the families that love and support them. The live stream of this ceremony is made possible by the Returned and Services League of Australia and the RSL Services Clubs Association. We welcome members who are watching the broadcast of this ceremony across Australia. During this evening's ceremony, wreaths will be laid at the base of the Pool of Reflection by visitors to the memorial and students on behalf of Tumbarumba Public School from Tumbarumba, New South Wales. If you're able, please stand and join in singing the National Anthem. If you're able, please be seated. The Australian War Memorial was the vision of Charles Bean, Australia's First World War official historian. Bean landed with the Australian troops on Gallipoli and stayed with them at the front throughout the end of the war. The idea of this National Memorial Museum came to him at Pozières, France, in the depths of the bloody fighting of 1916. Bean's idea was that this would be a place where families and friends could mourn loved ones buried in faraway places. It would also be a place that could help all Australians understand what these men and women had endured and what they'd done for us. Bean's vision, to which we remain true, is best expressed as inscribed in the entrance to the memorial's galleries. Here is their spirit, in the heart of the land they loved. And here we guard the record which they themselves made. Tonight, we will read just one of those stories on the Roll of Honour, which lists the names of more than 103,000 men and women who have given their lives for us in war and on operations for more than a century. But first, we present a lament, Flowers of the Forest. Wreaths will now be laid at the base of the pool of reflection.
Today we remember and pay tribute to Private Albert Leonard Cummings. Albert Cummings was born on the 17th of March 1918 in the Sydney suburb of Newtown. The son of Arthur and Ruby Cummings, he went on to work as a storeman living in the suburb of Kogarah with his family. Albert Cummings enlisted in the 2nd Australian Imperial Force on the 17th of June 1941. He joined a training brigade and began training in Dubbo. In July, he was granted pre-embarkation leave. Upon his return, he was found absent without leave and was fined for his breach of military discipline. On the 17th of September, Private Albert Cummings embarked from Sydney bound for overseas service. Arriving in Singapore in October, Cummings was taken on strength of the 2nd 20th Battalion, which had deployed to the port of Mersing on Malaya's east coast. With war against Japan looking increasingly likely, the battalion prepared defensive positions. After the Japanese invaded Malaya on the 8th of December 1941, over a month passed before the 2nd 20th saw action. On the 7th of January, C Company was sent to delay the Japanese approach to Endau further to the north. Cummings was wounded on the 22nd of January 1942, but continued serving without extensive treatment. In the meantime, Japanese troops had been engaged near the 2nd 20th main position around Mersing. Rejoined by C Company, the battalion withdrew, and by the end of the month arrived at Singapore to defend the island's west coast. When the Japanese launched their invasion on the night of the 8th of February, the battalion's widely dispersed positions were soon infiltrated, though the Australians were able to inflict heavy casualties. Despite the confused fighting, most of the battalion was able to withdraw in good order to form a defensive perimeter along Chim Lung Kang Road. It soon became apparent, however, that the battalion would be overwhelmed, so they were ordered to withdraw southwards. Scattered, the battalion never fought as a formed unit again. In parties of varying sizes, the troops made a desperate fighting retreat towards Singapore City that ended with surrender on the night of the 15th of February. Initially imprisoned in the sprawling Changi prisoner of war camp, it was not long before members of the 2nd 20th were allocated to external work parties. Cummings became one of the almost 1,500 prisoners of war that made up B Force, which sailed from Singapore on the 8th of July 1942 in one of the so-called hell ships, the Ubi Maru. Japanese prisoner of war transports became notorious for poor conditions. Crammed into cargo holds with little air, ventilation, flood or water for journeys that would last weeks, Many died due to asphyxia, starvation, or dysentery. Some prisoners became delirious and unresponsive in their environment of heat, humidity, and lack of oxygen, food, and water. Carrying a mix of prisoners and regular Japanese troops and cargo, the ships could be attacked by Allied submarines and aircraft and were at risk of being sunk before they even reached their destination. More than 20,000 Allied prisoners of war died at sea when the transport ships carrying them were attacked by Allied submarines and aircraft. The Ubi Maru did, however, complete its journey on the 18th of July. After establishing camp at Sandakan on the northeast coast of North Borneo, the prisoners were employed in building an airstrip. At first, conditions and food supplies were reasonable. However, from September 1942, the Japanese control began to tighten. Prisoners were made to sign a promise not to escape, and senior officers were moved to Kuching in Western Borneo. Shortly after arriving at Sandakan, the prisoners took the risk of creating a secret intelligence organisation. They made contact with the Australian doctor in charge of a local government hospital, members of the local constabulary, and local Chinese and civilian internees on a nearby island. Through these networks, they gained medicines, maps of the local area, and the materials to create a radio transmitter. They also developed plans for an uprising in the event of an Allied landing. In late March 1943, a second group of Australians and British prisoners, E-Force, arrived in Kuching. 500 Australians continued to Bahala Island and then in early June to Sandakan on the mainland. From mid-1943, conditions at Sandakan deteriorated, thanks partly to the arrival of the brutal Formosan guards. A small cage was built within the camp to punish prisoners for trivial offences. Some men were confined without being able to stand up and with little food for as long as a month. In July 1943, the underground movement was betrayed. Over the following months, 22 Australians, 5 Europeans, and around 50 local people were interrogated and tortured by the Japanese police. Some were imprisoned at Singapore, while others were executed. The treatment of the remaining prisoners deteriorated further in 1944, with brutal beatings, torture, and shrinking food supplies. By September 1944, 120 Australians and 90 British had died. 33 prisoners had been killed by Allied bombing in September 1944 and April 1945. In January 1945, the Japanese began to fear an Allied invasion of Borneo. In response, they began moving prisoners away from the coast overland to Ranau, a small village some 250 kilometres inland to the west. The first group of 455 prisoners, including 350 Australians, left in batches of 50 beginning on the 28th of January. They were already weak from beriberi and malnutrition, and most lacked boots. Those who fell by the wayside or were unable to continue were executed along the way. After Australian troops landed at Tarakan Island on the 1st of May, Sandakan itself was bombed by Allied aircraft towards the end of the month. This forced the abandonment and torching of the Sandakan POW camp. 536 prisoners fit to move began the second death march on the 29th, while the weak and ill were left behind without accommodation, food, nor medical care. According to the accounts of Japanese guards, they slowly died or were shot in the weeks that followed. It appears that Private Cummings was among those not fit to attempt the second march. He remained in the burnt-out, abandoned camp where he died of malaria on the 7th of June 1945. Albert Cummings was 27 years old. A third and final march of just 75 prisoners commenced a week after Cummings died. Ultimately, only 6 survived the Sandakan death marches. They survived appalling conditions in the jungle until, with the help of local people, they made contact with Allied forces. They would tell their stories. Private Cummings was buried in No. 2 Cemetery at Sandakan Prisoner of War Camp. After the war, his remains were either unrecovered or unidentified. He is therefore commemorated in the Labuan Memorial alongside over 2,000 Australians who died while prisoners of war in Borneo and the Philippines who have no known grave. His name is listed on the Roll of Honour on my left, amongst almost 40,000 Australians who died while serving in the Second World War. His photograph is displayed today by the Pool of Reflection. This is but one of the many stories of service and sacrifice told here at the Australian War Memorial. We now remember Private Albert Leonard Cummings, who gave his life for us, for our freedoms, and in the hope of a better world.
Please stand for the reading of the Ode and the sounding of the last post.
They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them.
We will remember them.
Lest we forget.
Lest we forget. We leave you this evening with the words of the memorial's founder, Charles Bean. Many a man lying out there at Poziere or in the low scrub at Gallipoli, with his poor, tired senses barely working through the fever of his brain, has thought in his last moments, well, it's over. But in Australia, they will be proud of this. Ladies and gentlemen, girls and boys, that concludes the last post ceremony. On behalf of the director, staff and volunteers, thank you for visiting the Australian War Memorial today and your continued support during the memorial's development project. We wish you a very pleasant evening. Thank you.